Them bones, them dry bones, now they're the working of the Lord. Bones are heard of, but seldom seen, except each year round Halloween. But I've got a shockaroo. Right now there's a skeleton locked up inside of you. Minus bones, you're just a blow. Being frameworks, every job. All your organs, muscles too. They need your bones to hold them safe and sound inside for you. Your heart and lungs are tucked away, and they're behind your ribs. Those bones have been protecting them since we were little kids. Look out! Here comes a bonehead plane. Burn his brain. Tweet, tweet, tweet. What a day! Don't take much to overwhelm it, but luckily those bones up there work like a built-in helmet. Shin bone connected to the knee bone. That means the tibia connects to the patella. Knee bone connected to the thigh bone. That means the patella connects to the femur. And here's how they really fit together. Ligaments are what link bone to bone. Cartilage that cushions in between. Muscles are guarded by the tendons. So here's what's happening in your knees most every time you bend them. Now there's a lot of skeleton we never get to see, but it holds other little parts that show quite obviously. I'm talking about those 32 that we all call our teeth. You gotta feed them right and keep them clean, or they can come to grief. Ouch! Oh, remember, you got to do it while you're young. Feed your bones some calcium. Drinking milk, a glass or two will help your bones to stay in shape and do their job for you. Your skeleton. It's a framework, yes, holding you together. Shielding organs, yes, that's his job too.
Well, welcome to Welcome to chapter 7, which is the skeletal system. And in this chapter, we're going to talk about what bones are, how they function. We're going to talk about growth and development of bones. We'll talk about the different forms of bone formation, different types of bone formation, and we're going to talk about how bone, or what influences bones to form or rebuild themselves, okay? The skeletal system, it's an organ system, which means it has multiple types of tissues. It has bone tissue, which is connective tissue. It has cartilage, both hyaline cartilage and fibrocartilage, which is another type of, are both types of connective tissues. Ligaments and tendons that are associated with the skeletal system. There's blood, which is another connective tissue, and there are nerves, which is not connective tissue, it's nervous tissue. So the main organ, though, is the bone. So bones, I know a lot of people are like, bones aren't organs, they're bones, but they are organs. And one of their major jobs is to provide framework for your body. But they have a lot of other jobs as well. There are 2 basic types of bones, and each type of bone is going to have different functions. So compact bone, which is the type of bone that I expect you to know by sight, Looks very much like what you might see if you were to cut a tree. You see those large structures called osteons right here with multiple rings. This is the majority of the bone. This is what makes up the majority of the bone. It is very strong. Its major function is for strength, protection. And then we have spongy bone. Spongy bone is very, well, spongy in appearance, which is why it gets its name as spongy bone. It makes up a small portion, only about 20% of the bone, but it also has very important functions. One of the major functions of spongy bone is to lighten bone. If all of our bone was completely solid, we wouldn't be able to move our body properly. We have cartilage. There's two types of cartilage that make up or that function or work in our skeletal system. Hyaline cartilage, which you find at the ends of all of your long bones. And then we have fibrocartilage. Fibrocartilage is found in between bones where there's a lot of compression. So intervertebral discs in the pubic symphysis, in the meniscus of the knees, and the meniscus between our jaw joint, or within our jaw joint. We have dense regular connective tissue that makes up our ligaments and tendons. Ligaments hold bone to bone, tendons hold muscle to bone. Dense regular connective tissue is avascular, so are both of the cartilages, so they don't heal as effectively. Vascular material heals much better. This shows where the different cartilages are found. So you can see at the ends of all of our long bones, we have hyaline cartilage. In between our joints, where we have a lot of compression, we have fibrocartilage. So one of the major jobs of bone is for support and to protect the organs. It gives our body structure. So it produces the framework of our body. It protects the organs that are deep to our body, provides a site for muscles to attach with the tendons, and then our bones allow us to move, because if our bones have a site for the muscles to attach, then when the muscles move, our bones move and our body moves. Hemopoiesis, that is blood cell production. All blood cells are produced in red bone marrow, and red bone marrow is found within the spongy bone. And then it stores different materials. It stores fat in yellow bone marrow. It stores calcium and phosphate in red bone marrow. Or not in red bone marrow, I'm sorry, in the bone tissue itself. So here's what a skeleton looks like. It provides the structure of the body. So if we didn't have the skeleton, then we'd be a pile of connective tissues, muscle tissue, and nerve tissue that could move because, well, skeletal muscle moves, but we'd move more like an amoeba. It's very protective of the deep organs like the brain, our spinal cord, lungs, heart, reproductive organs. They allow for skeletal muscle to attach, and because skeletal muscle can attach, then we can move our bones, which means we can move our body. So we can walk, we can lift things. Here we have red bone marrow, which is the site of blood cell production, and you can see yellow bone marrow in between. Red bone marrow is found in spongy bone, and this is just a slide showing what blood looks like. There's some white blood cells. These are your neutrophils. Here are some platelets, and then we have a ton of red blood cells all around, okay? Storage, bone stores calcium and phosphate in bone tissue. It's actually what helps to make bones hard. So it's nice and hard, and they don't bend with our weight. And then we have storage of fat in yellow bone marrow, which is found in a cavity in the middle of the bone called the medullary cavity. You can see right here that middle of the bone area. We cut off the top of the bone here, and you can see into the medullary cavity. There are 4 types of bones determined by their shape. We have long bones that are longer in length than they are in width. We have short bones that have equal amounts of length and width about. Flat bones tend to be very flat and slightly curved. And then we have irregular bones that don't fit any other category. So here are some examples of long bones. All of our phalanges are called long bones. And so these are all phalanges. They're long bones. Our metacarpals and metatarsals are long bones. Our humerus, tibia, fibula, those are all long bones. Long bones are the most common bone in the body. Long bones can be very, very tiny, like these distal phalanxes, but they're still longer than they are thick. Short bones have similar length and width. So these are all short bones, carpals. Your tarsals are short bones. Your patella's a short bone. Short bones that form in areas where we have a lot of stress from joint movement are called sesamoid bones. And so this is a short bone. The patella is a short bone. It's also a sesamoid bone. Sesamoid bones form in areas where we have a lot of stress. So typically we see sesamoid bones in our fingers, in our toes, and this means that not all adults have the same amount of bones because some people form more sesamoid bones than others. Flat bones are very flat structurally, so ribs, the sternum, your cranial bones, your scapula, these are all flat bones. They have slight curve to them. They are formed by 2 layers of compact bone with a very small amount of spongy bone in between. And they function in protection of other organs. And then we have these irregular bones. Irregular bones are bones that don't fit into any other category. So in our skull, we have the ethmoid bone and the sphenoid bone, which I'll show you on Wednesday. We have vertebrae. We have coxal bones, which are made up of actually 3 different bones that fuse together. These are all irregularly shaped bones. This is just a figure that shows the different types of bones that we have structurally. So now let's look at the anatomy of a long bone. Since long bones are one of the most common bone types, let's look at the structure of the long bone. Long bones have a very long length. The length of the long bone is called the diaphysis. At the ends of each long bone, we have a region called the epiphysis. The diaphysis contains a medullary cavity. It's a hollowed out region, and in adults, this hollowed out region contains yellow bone marrow, so fat storage. In children and infants, this medullary cavity contains red bone marrow for blood cell production. The epiphyses are on each end, and the end closest to the point of attachment is called the proximal epiphysis. The one farther from the point of attachment is called the distal epiphysis. At the ends of each epiphysis, we have hyaline cartilage known as articular cartilage. So it's articular cartilage composed of hyaline cartilage. Between the epiphysis and the diaphysis is a region called the metaphysis. So the metaphysis is a region that contains a growth plate known as the epiphyseal plate. The metaphysis is basically composed of cartilage in infants and children, and as we get older, the metaphysis shrinks and becomes, or within the metaphysis, the epiphyseal plate, or epiphyseal, plate shrinks, and the metaphysis becomes predominantly bone. And so what the epiphyseal plate allows is for bone growth in length in infants and children. But once we hit adulthood, we only have a remnant of that called the epiphyseal line, which is one way we can identify adults from children. And so here's that metaphysis again, which mainly is composed of cartilage. But as this shrinks, then the bone takes over, and eventually we'll be left with just an epiphyseal line. Surrounding our long bone is a dense irregular connective tissue wrapping called the periosteum. Periosteum actually contains stem cells that will produce new bone cells when needed. It also contains blood vessels that can move into the blood, nerve endings that can move into the blood vessels that can move into the bone, and nerves that move into the bone. The dense irregular connective tissue, periosteum, is connected to the bone by these perforating fibers, which you see right here, and you can see the cells right there. All right, so here you see a close-up picture of the cellular layer, and within that cellular layer we have these osteoprogenitor cells. Osteoprogenitor cells are the cells that produce new bone cells. And then we have all of these osteoblasts, which are baby bone cells that produce the bony matrix. Within these areas, these little tiny curved out areas, or I don't know, holes in the bone, we have the osteocytes that sit there and maintain that matrix. In the internal region, in the medullary cavity, we also have an endosteum, which contains different bone cells, osteoprogenitor cells, osteoblasts. We have the osteocytes, but we also have these special large bone cells called osteoblasts or osteoclasts. And osteoclasts are bone-breaking cells. They're your white blood cell macrophages of the skeletal system. And so they break down bone. Specifically, if we're thickening bone on the outside, we have to make the medullary cavity thicker as well, or larger as well, or else our bone would become too thick and we wouldn't be able to hold our bones or hold our body up properly. So that's showing all the different cell types, and we'll talk about each of these cell types in a little bit. Short, flat, and irregular bones all have a similar structure. They're composed of two layers of compact bone with a thin layer of spongy bone in between. There's no medullary cavity associated with short, flat, or irregular bones, but the spongy bone can still have red bloods or red bone marrow in it for blood cell production, specifically in infants and children. Bone has a very good blood supply. It also has extensive innervation. So it's a highly vascular connective tissue, which allows bone to heal very effectively. The nerves that move into bone mainly are sensory, so we can feel pain when bone gets broken. You have a lot of pain associated with it because the nerves get damaged, and they will send signals. They get stimulated, send signals, and you get a lot of pain associated with those nerves. Bone marrow is a soft connective tissue. There are two types: red bone marrow, which is where blood cell production occurs, and yellow bone marrow, which is basically stored tissue for stored energy tissue. Red bone marrow is also known as myeloid tissue, and this is where hemopoiesis occurs. Hemopoiesis is blood cell formation. So all blood, white blood cells, red blood cells, lymphocytic cells, platelets, everything is formed in bone marrow, red bone marrow. In adults, or I should say no, and red bone marrow is found in spongy bone as well as in the medullary cavity of children. In adults, it's mainly found in the red bone marrow of specific regions of the axial skeleton, as well as in some of the long bones. But we can still convert some of the yellow bone marrow into red bone marrow when we need to. Yellow bone marrow is fat tissue. It's basically adipose tissue that's being stored. And if we need to, we can convert yellow bone marrow back to red bone marrow if our body needs extra blood for whatever reason. I like that picture because it shows yellow and red bone marrow together. So bone is connective tissue. It is supportive connective tissue, and it's composed of bone cells as well as an extracellular matrix. The matrix is solid, but it still has a lot of vascularity because we have holes or perforations within the bone that allow for blood vessels, and nerves to move through. There are 4 types of bone cells. Osteoprogenitor cells, which are your bone building cells. They're the stem cells that decide what they want to do, and then they will differentiate. When they do differentiate, they differentiate into osteoblasts, which are your baby bone cells that produce the extracellular matrix. Once they are surrounded by extracellular matrix, they are then known as osteocytes, which maintain the matrix. And then we have the macrophages of the skeletal system called osteoclasts, which break down the bony matrix. So osteoprogenitor cells, these are those cells up here. When they get stimulated, they produce new osteoblasts. Osteoblasts then produce the bone matrix, which is composed of collagen fibers and other proteoglycans that is semi-solid, but eventually will take in calcium and phosphate and produce this very hard bone matrix. When they become trapped, they become osteocytes. Osteocytes are bone, kind of bone cells that maintain or send signals out when there are changes within the bone. So they detect changes and send signals out either to tell the osteoclasts, which are your bone killing cells, to break bone down, or it might stimulate osteoprogenitor cells to produce new osteoblasts. Osteoclasts then are your phagocytic bone cells that break down bony matrix. And when they do so, they cause or they release calcium and phosphate into the extracellular environment. So these are the macrophages of the skeletal system. And there you can see an osteoclast, and its job, it will release chemicals that break down bone. So what is the matrix composed of? Osteoblasts produce osteoid, which is the bony which is the matrix of bone. Mainly, osteoid is composed of collagen fibers, but there are other proteins in it, proteoglycans, glycoproteins, that help to hold the bone together. The collagen fibers provide a tensile strength for bone. So when you say tensile strength, that means it has slight flexibility, and it won't snap. If the bone, it doesn't have that tensile strength, any pressure on bone could snap the bone. Think of a piece of wood that is really old and has no actual like protectors inside. They're really, really brittle. They snap really easily. That's the same with our bone if it had no collagen. Inorganic portion of the matrix is produced by the deposition of calcium and phosphate. So when calcium and phosphate come together, they produce a crystal called hydroxyapatite. And hydroxyapatite gives bone its hardness. So now we have a hard bone that has tensile strength, and that's what makes bones so strong. We don't want bone to be too hard, and we don't want bone to be too bendy. So we need to have organic and inorganic in proper proportions. If we lose the hardness, bone can actually become very, very bendy. And you see that when you're looking at bone that has been soaked in hydrochloric acid. If we lose the tensility of bone, but maintain the hardness, bone becomes very brittle and we can snap it very easily. This is what causes different disorders. So rickets is a disorder where individuals typically lack vitamin D. And so we get vitamin D by producing it through our skin, taking in UV radiation. UV radiation stimulates our keratinocytes to produce a pre-vitamin D that then moves to the liver. It's converted to another pre-vitamin D, which moves to kidneys. And then when stimulated, the kidneys will release the active form of vitamin D called calcitriol, which increases calcium reabsorption. So we take calcium back in from the intestines, we take calcium in from the kidneys, so we don't lose calcium in our defecation or in our urine. With rickets, people are lacking that vitamin D, either because they're not getting it in their diet, which if you're in a developed country, typically you get vitamin D in your diet when you're drinking milk. But It can also be caused because you're not getting enough sunlight. And so people who don't have the nutrients in their diet can get vitamin D, can produce vitamin D by being exposed to sunlight. So if you don't have sunlight and you don't have the proper diet, then you're going to end up potentially with very, very rubbery bones. And that's what you're seeing here. This is Osteomalacia. And again, so in children it's called rickets, in adults it's called osteomalacia, where the bones don't have as much calcium in them. And because of that, they're not able to hold the weight properly, and they start to bend. Another disorder is called osteogenesis imperfecta, or brittle bone disease. So this is due to a lack of collagen. So either, and this is typically a genetic disorder, whereas this one can be genetic, it's most likely due to a deficiency in the diet. This one is a genetic disorder where the gene to produce collagen is mutated. There are different levels of this disorder. So osteogenesis imperfecta can cause people to not be able to produce any collagen, or can cause people to produce less collagen, or a collagen that doesn't work properly. So depending on the type of disorder you have, while you're growing, your bones, when they have more pressure put on them, won't be able to hold the weight. And this causes bones to break very easily. When you're born, you tend to be born and have broken bones, and your bones tend to break very easily throughout your life. This causes mutations within the skeletal structure. Individuals that have this disorder tend to be shorter than normal because of the damage to those to the growth plates, and they tend to have disfiguring marks too because bones don't heal properly. So now we're going to talk about bone formation. There's different materials needed for bones to form and for bones to break down. So osteoblasts are what form bone. And so for osteoblasts to produce the amount of collagen that is needed, we need to have vitamin C. We also need, because osteoid has to solidify, we have to have calcium and phosphate in the proper amount so that we can settle the calcium phosphate as hydroxyapatite into the osteoid to make it hard. Bone resorption occurs when we no longer need the bone, but we need the calcium in our blood. Typically, bone is resorbed either because the bone has been damaged or because the bone or because the individual needs calcium in their blood. Their blood calcium levels drop. And that stimulates osteoclasts to start digesting or breaking down that bony matrix. I'm going to stop here for this video. It's at 34 minutes, so I will stop here and we'll start on the microscopic anatomy of bone in just a few minutes.